The lecture hall fell silent as Professor Martinez's eyes locked onto the small silver pin on Sarah's backpack. Among hundreds of students, something about that tiny Apache helicopter caught his attention, and for good reason. He recognized it immediately, because he wore the same one 20 years ago in Afghanistan. But what he discovered about this quiet college sophomore would shake him to his core. Sarah wasn't just any student. She was carrying secrets that would change everything he thought he knew about the young woman sitting in the third row. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Lecture Hall B, casting long shadows across rows of sleepy college students. Professor David Martinez adjusted his microphone and scanned the familiar sea of faces, some attentive, others clearly wishing they were still in bed. Teaching. Introduction to Political Science at 9 a.m. was never easy, but after 15 years in academia, he'd learned to work with what he had. Today we're discussing the role of military intervention in foreign policy, he announced, clicking to his first slide. As he spoke about diplomatic relations and strategic decisions, his eyes naturally wandered across his students, a habit developed from years of gauging engagement. Most stared at their laptops, presumably taking notes, though he suspected several were catching up on social media. Then his gaze stopped on a young woman in the third row. Sarah Chen. He remembered her name from attendance, though she rarely spoke up in class. She was one of those students who seemed to blend into the background, always punctual, always prepared, but never drawing attention to herself. Today, however, something was different. As she reached into her backpack for a notebook, the light caught something metallic pinned to the front pocket. Martinez felt his breath catch. There, small but unmistakable, was a silver Apache helicopter pin. Not the kind of military memorabilia you could buy at any surplus store, but the real thing, the kind earned through sweat, blood, and countless hours of training. He would know. He'd worn the same pin 20 years ago when he was Captain Martinez serving in Afghanistan. His lecture continued on autopilot while his mind raced. The pin could belong to a family member, he reasoned. Maybe her father or brother had served. But something about the way she unconsciously touched it when she was thinking, the careful way it was positioned. These weren't the actions of someone wearing a borrowed piece of jewelry. These were the unconscious habits of someone who had earned the right to wear it. Martinez found himself studying Sarah more intently as the class progressed. Her posture was straighter than most students, her eyes constantly scanning the room, behaviors he recognized from his own military days. When a car backfired in the parking lot outside, she was the only student whose head snapped toward the window, her body tensing for just a moment before she forced herself to relax. The decision to deploy military assets, he continued his lecture, requires understanding not just strategic objectives, but the human cost involved. Each aircraft, each mission, represents real people making split-second decisions under incredible pressure. He watched Sarah's face as he spoke. Her expression remained neutral, but he caught the slight tightening around her eyes, the way her hand unconsciously moved to that pin again. As the hour wound down and students began packing their belongings, Martinez made a decision that would change everything. Instead of his usual dismissal, he called out, "Miss Chen, could I speak with you for a moment after class?" Sarah looked up, clearly surprised. She nodded quietly and waited as the other students filed out, their conversations about weekend plans and upcoming exams fading into the hallway. When they were alone, Martinez approached her desk, his eyes drawn once again to that small silver helicopter. "That's an interesting pin you have there," he said gently, keeping his voice neutral. He'd learned during his military service that direct confrontation rarely yielded the best results. Sometimes you had to circle around the target. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to cover the pin, her eyes wary. "It's nothing special, just something I picked up somewhere." But Martinez had seen that defensive reaction too many times to be fooled. He'd worn that same expression when he first returned to civilian life, when well-meaning strangers would ask about his service, and he wasn't ready to talk about the things he'd seen and done. The weight of carrying experiences that seemed impossible to share with people who had never faced anything more dangerous than a difficult exam. "You know," he said, settling into the desk beside hers, "I had one just like it. back when I was flying missions out of Bagram. That particular pin, it's not something you just pick up somewhere. It's something you earn. Sarah's carefully maintained composure cracked just slightly, like hairline fractures appearing in tempered glass. She glanced toward the door as if calculating her escape route, then back at Professor Martinez. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. Her fingers still hovered protectively over the pin, betraying the lie even as she spoke it. Martinez leaned back in his chair, recognizing the stance of someone who had learned to be cautious about revealing too much, too quickly. "It's okay," he said quietly. "I'm not here to interrogate you, but I spent enough years around pilots to recognize the signs, the way you carry yourself, how you scan a room when you enter, that split-second reaction when the car backfired outside. These aren't things you learn in civilian life." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't realized her habits were so obvious, so readable to someone who knew what to look for. For months, she'd been working so hard to blend in, to be just another college student worried about midterms and dating and whether the cafeteria would serve pizza again. She thought she'd been successful. "How long?" Martinez asked gently. "How long what? How long have you been back?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Sarah looked down at her hands, twisted together in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. 8 months. I got out last spring and started here in the fall semester." Apache pilot? It wasn't really a question. The pin told him everything he needed to know about her qualifications. Sarah nodded slowly. "Chief Warrant Officer Sarah Chen, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. 3 tours, mostly Afghanistan, some classified locations I can't talk about." The words came out in a rush, as if saying them quickly would somehow make them easier. Martinez felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the recognition of shared experience, of burdens carried alone. "The Night Stalkers. That's serious business. How old are you, Sarah?" 24. "Jesus." Martinez shook his head. "You were flying combat missions while your classmates were deciding on college majors." "Yeah, well, I had other priorities back then." Sarah's voice carried an edge of bitterness. "Turns out high school guidance counselors don't prepare you for transitioning from special ops to freshman composition class." "Why are you hiding it?" Martinez asked. "Your service, I mean. Most veterans I know are proud of what they did." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at the empty lecture hall around them. "Because when people find out, everything changes. Suddenly you're not Sarah the student anymore. You're Sarah the veteran, Sarah the war hero, Sarah the person who did things they can't imagine. They either put you on a pedestal, or they look at you like you're damaged goods." She paused, then continued with painful honesty. "My roommate found out last month when a package from the VA came to our dorm. Now she treats me like I'm going to snap and hurt someone. She actually asked our RA if she could switch rooms because she was uncomfortable living with someone who had PTSD. I never said I had PTSD. I never said anything at all." Martinez winced. He remembered his own early days back in civilian life, the way conversations would stop when people learned about his military background, how they'd thank him for his service, and then change the subject as quickly as possible, as if his experiences were too heavy for polite conversation. "So you decided it was easier to hide it," he said. "Wouldn't you?" Sarah challenged. "These kids worry about whether their parents will pay for spring break. They stress about getting into the right sorority or whether their boyfriend really likes them. How do you relate to that when you've been responsible for million-dollar aircraft and the lives of the soldiers you were extracting from hostile territory?" The raw honesty in her voice hit Martinez like a physical blow. She was right, of course. The gulf between military and civilian experience could feel insurmountable, especially for someone who had served in such high-stakes positions at such a young age. "It doesn't get easier by hiding," he said gently. "Trust me, I tried that approach for the first few years after I got out. All it did was make me feel more isolated." Sarah looked at him with new interest. "You really served?" Captain David Martinez, 82nd Airborne, then transferred to aviation. I flew Kiowas mostly, some Blackhawks. Did 3 tours myself before I decided academia looked like a safer bet. He smiled wryly. Turns out dealing with college administrators isn't that different from military bureaucracy. For the first time since he'd asked her to stay after class, Sarah smiled. Just a small upturn of her lips, but genuine. At least in the military, people are honest about wanting to kill you. Martinez laughed, surprised by her dark humor. Now that sounds like a Night Stalker talking. What years were you in Afghanistan? Sarah asked, her wariness beginning to give way to curiosity. There was something comforting about talking to someone who understood the weight of military acronyms and the unspoken rules of deployment life. 2009 to 2011, then again in 2013, Martinez replied. Forward operating base Shank mostly, with some time at Bagram. You? 2019 to 2021, then 2022 to early 2023. Sarah's voice carried a note of recognition. Fob Shank was still active when I was there, though it was winding down. We used it as a staging area for some of our operations. Martinez felt that strange sensation that veterans sometimes experience, the recognition that their paths had crossed in ways neither could have imagined. What were you flying out of there? Mostly night insertions and extractions, special forces teams, sometimes SEAL units, the kind of missions where you go in dark, stay invisible, and pray everyone you dropped off is still breathing when you come back to get them. Sarah's voice had changed, taking on the clipped professional tone that came with discussing operational matters. We lost a lot of good people in those mountains. I remember those mountains, Martinez said quietly. The way the terrain could hide threats until you were right on top of them. The thin air that made every takeoff feel like you were flying on borrowed time. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in memories of a landscape that had shaped them in ways their current surroundings never could. The lecture hall, with its modern technology and comfortable seating, felt like another world entirely. Did you ever feel like you were living in 2 different universes? Sarah asked suddenly. Like, when I was deployed, this place, she gestured around the classroom, felt like a fantasy. College students worried about grades and parties seemed like something from a movie. But now that I'm here, sometimes Afghanistan feels like the dream. Like maybe I made it all up. Martinez nodded emphatically. The disconnect is real. I spent my first semester back teaching basic political science to kids who'd never been outside their home state, trying to explain concepts of international conflict to people who'd never seen what war actually looks like. He paused. Some days I felt like I was speaking a different language entirely. Exactly. Sarah leaned forward, animated in a way she hadn't been during any of his lectures. Yesterday, a girl in my sociology class was complaining about how traumatic it was when the coffee shop ran out of her favorite latte. I just sat there thinking about the time we had to extract a team that had been pinned down for 6 hours, and 3 of them didn't make it to the bird alive. But I can't say that. You can't tell people that their problems seem small because then you're the bitter veteran who can't adjust to normal life. So you carry it alone, Martinez observed. So I carry it alone, she confirmed. Because what's the alternative? Start every conversation with, well, back when I was dodging RPGs. People don't want to hear it. They want to thank you for your service and then move on to something more comfortable. Martinez understood that isolation intimately. When I first started teaching here, I mentioned my military background once during a faculty meeting. Suddenly, every discussion about foreign policy became, let's ask David, he was there. But they didn't really want my perspective. They wanted me to validate whatever point they were trying to make. My actual experiences were too complicated for their neat political theories. How do you handle it now? Sarah asked. Honestly, some days better than others. But I learned that hiding it completely doesn't work either. It just makes you feel like a fraud, like you're pretending to be someone you're not. Martinez stood up and walked to the window, looking out at students crossing the quad with their backpacks and casual conversations. I started small, mentioned my service when it was relevant to the curriculum, let students know they could talk to me if they needed to. You'd be surprised how many veterans are sitting in these classrooms, hiding just like you are. Sarah looked surprised. There are others? More than you might think. Different branches, different eras, but the same struggle to figure out how their military experience fits into civilian life. Martinez turned back to her. There's a guy in my Wednesday class, Marcus Thompson. Marine Corps, did time in Iraq. Sits in the back corner, never says much, but I can tell by the way he carries himself. And Jenny Rodriguez in my comparative government seminar. Air Force, I think, probably intelligence based on the way she analyzes information. You can just tell? After a while, yes. It's like recognizing your own tribe. Martinez returned to his seat. The question is, what are you going to do with that information? Sarah was quiet for several minutes, processing everything they'd discussed. When she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful. I enlisted because I wanted to serve something bigger than myself. I wanted to make a difference. But sitting in these classes, listening to theoretical discussions about conflicts I lived through, I feel like I'm wasting what I learned over there. Maybe you are, Martinez said bluntly. Or maybe you're just looking at it wrong. Your experiences don't have to be separate from your education. They can inform it. You bring a perspective to these discussions that no textbook can provide. But how do I do that without becoming the war story girl? Without every conversation turning into Sarah's trauma hour? Martinez smiled, very carefully and very selectively. But Sarah, hiding who you are is not protecting anyone. It's just cheating your classmates out of learning from someone who's lived the things they are only reading about. And it's cheating you out of finding your place in this new world. The conversation with Professor Martinez had opened something in Sarah that she'd kept carefully locked away for months. Over the next few days, she found herself noticing things she'd trained herself to ignore. The way her heart rate spiked when doors slammed too loudly, how she always chose seats with clear views of exits, the hypervigilance that never quite switched off even in the safest environments. Tuesday morning, she sat in her American literature class trying to focus on a discussion of post-war poetry, but her mind kept drifting. The professor was analyzing Wilfred Owen's Dulci et Decorum Est, reading passages about gas attacks and dying soldiers with the clinical detachment of someone who had never smelled cordite or felt the weight of responsibility for other people's lives. The poet challenges the notion that it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. The professor explained to the class of 20-something students who nodded thoughtfully as if they were discussing an abstract philosophical concept rather than the visceral reality of watching people die. Sarah's hands clenched involuntarily as memories surfaced unbidden. The night operation when her Apache had been providing close air support for a ground team pinned down by insurgent fire. She could still hear the radio chatter, the increasing desperation in the voices as they called for immediate extraction. The weight of knowing that her split-second decisions could mean the difference between soldiers going home to their families or coming home in flag-draped boxes. Miss Chen? The professor's voice cut through her flashback. Do you have thoughts on Owen's use of imagery to convey the horror of warfare? Sarah blinked, realizing the entire class was looking at her. For a moment, she considered giving the safe academic answer. Something about metaphor and symbolism that would satisfy the professor and let her fade back into anonymity. Instead, she heard herself saying, I think Owen understood something that people who haven't been there can't really grasp. It's not just the physical horror, it's the responsibility. The knowledge that your decisions, your mistakes, your split-second reactions affect real people with real families waiting for them to come home. The classroom fell silent. Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks as she realized she'd said too much, revealed too much. But she couldn't stop now. When you're reading about war, she continued, her voice growing stronger, it's easy to focus on the grand strategies and political implications. But when you're living it, it's about the 19-year-old kid from Ohio who's scared out of his mind, and whether you can get to him before the enemy does. Owen gets that. The personal cost. Her professor stared at her with new interest. That's a very personal interpretation. Do you have experience with military literature? Something like that, Sarah said quietly, and the moment passed. But she could feel the curious glances from her classmates for the rest of the period. After class, a student approached her. Jake Morrison, whom she'd noticed mainly because he always wore expensive sneakers and talked loudly about his weekend parties. "Hey, that was pretty intense in there," he said, falling into step beside her as they left the building. "You sounded like you really knew what you were talking about. Are you like really into military history or something?" Sarah felt the familiar weight of decision. Reveal or deflect. "I've done some reading," she said finally. Cool. My grandfather was in Vietnam, so I get the whole family military thing. He never talks about it much, though. Says people today are too soft to understand what real war is like." Jake laughed as if he'd said something clever. "I mean, we've got it pretty easy compared to those guys, right?" The casual dismissal hit Sarah like a physical blow. Jake had no idea he was talking to someone who'd flown combat missions in active war zones, who'd seen friends die, who still woke up some nights with the sound of rotor blades in her ears. To him, military service was an abstract concept, something that happened to other people in other times. "Yeah," she managed. "Pretty easy." That evening, Sarah sat in her dorm room staring at her laptop screen. Her essay for political science was due tomorrow, a paper on the effectiveness of air power in modern conflicts. She'd chosen the topic without thinking, drawn by familiar territory. Now she realized her mistake. How could she write academically about something she'd lived through? How could she cite sources and maintain scholarly distance when she had first-hand knowledge of exactly how effective air power could be, and how devastating its failures were? Her roommate, Ashley, glanced over from her own desk where she was working on what appeared to be a psychology assignment about stress management. Since discovering Sarah's military background, Ashley had been walking on eggshells, treating her like a volatile explosive that might detonate at any moment. "You okay over there?" Ashley asked carefully. "You've been staring at that blank document for like an hour." Sarah wanted to explain that she was struggling to write about airstrikes and casualty rates without thinking about specific missions, specific faces, specific moments when everything had gone wrong despite perfect planning. Instead, she said, "Just writer's block. No big deal." "Maybe you should talk to someone," Ashley suggested. "I mean, the counseling center has people who specialize in, adjustment issues." The euphemism stung. Adjustment issues, as if Sarah's struggle was simply a matter of fine-tuning, like adjusting the settings on a machine rather than fundamentally rebuilding how she understood her place in the world. "I'm fine," Sarah said, turning back to her computer. But the words on the screen blurred as she fought back tears of frustration. She wasn't fine. She was drowning in a world that wanted to acknowledge her service with empty thank yous, while simultaneously expecting her to pretend it had never happened. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "How are classes going, sweetheart? Dad and I are so proud of how well you're adjusting to college life." Sarah stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Going great. Everything's normal here." Another lie. Another moment of hiding behind a version of herself that felt increasingly foreign. As she finally began typing her essay, using careful academic language to discuss conflicts she'd lived through, Sarah wondered if Professor Martinez had been right. Maybe hiding wasn't protecting anyone. It was just slowly erasing the person she'd worked so hard to become. The turning point came during Professor Martinez's class the following week. They were discussing veteran integration policies when a student raised her hand. "Professor, I don't understand why we need special programs for veterans. I mean, they chose to serve, right? Shouldn't they be prepared for the transition back to civilian life?" Sarah felt her jaw clench as murmurs of agreement rippled through the classroom. She'd heard variations of this sentiment before, the assumption that military service was just another job, that the transition should be simple and straightforward. Martinez's eyes found hers across the room. "That's an interesting perspective, Jessica. What do others think? Are there unique challenges that veterans face that might require specialized support?" Several students offered textbook answers about PTSD and job training, discussing veterans as if they were theoretical subjects rather than real people who might be sitting in the same room. Sarah felt the familiar urge to remain silent, to let the conversation flow around her while she observed from the safety of anonymity, but then she thought about Professor Martinez's words from their conversation the week before. Hiding who you are isn't protecting anyone. It's just cheating your classmates out of learning from someone who's lived the things they're only reading about. Sarah raised her hand. Yes, Miss Chen? I think, Sarah began, her voice steadier than she felt, that the question assumes civilian and military experiences are more similar than they actually are. When you spend years in an environment where split-second decisions can mean life or death, where your job is to protect others no matter the personal cost, transitioning to worrying about midterm grades and social dynamics can feel surreal. The classroom was quiet, sensing something different in her tone. I mean, Sarah continued, momentum building. Imagine spending months flying combat missions where everything you do has immediate, life or death consequences. Then you come back and your biggest stress is supposed to be whether you remembered to cite your sources correctly. It's not that one is harder than the other. They're just completely different worlds with completely different stakes. Jessica, the student who'd asked the original question, looked confused. But how would you know that? I mean, that's a pretty specific example. Sarah took a deep breath. Here it was, the moment of decision she'd been avoiding for months. Because I flew Apache helicopters for the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. 3 combat tours, mostly in Afghanistan. I got out 8 months ago and started here in the fall. The silence that followed was profound. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, could feel 20 pairs of eyes studying her with new intensity. She waited for the familiar responses, the awkward thank yous, the uncomfortable shifting, the sudden transformation from classmate to curiosity. But Professor Martinez's voice cut through the quiet with calm professionalism. Thank you for sharing that perspective, Sarah. Can you elaborate on what kinds of support might have been helpful during your transition? His matter-of-fact tone gave her permission to continue treating this as an academic discussion, rather than a dramatic revelation. Honestly, someone who understood that the skills that make you good at military service, hypervigilance, quick decision-making, assuming responsibility for others, don't just turn off when you get to civilian life. They can actually make normal college interactions harder. Marcus Thompson, the student Professor Martinez had mentioned as a fellow veteran, suddenly spoke up from his usual back corner seat. Like when people complain about things that seem trivial compared to what you've been through, but you can't say anything because then you're the angry veteran who can't relate to normal problems. Sarah turned to look at him, recognizing a kindred spirit. Exactly. Or when you're in a crowded place and you're automatically cataloging exit routes and potential threats, but everyone else is just focused on having a good time. Wait, said Jenny Rodriguez from the middle of the room. You do that too? I thought that was just me being paranoid. Professor Martinez smiled knowingly. Jenny, Air Force Intelligence? How did you... Yes. 2 tours in Iraq, got out last year. Jenny looked around the classroom with surprise. Are there others? What followed was unlike any college class Sarah had ever experienced. One by one, 5 other veterans in the room identified themselves. Different branches, different eras, but similar stories of isolation and the struggle to bridge military and civilian worlds. David Kim, Navy submariner. Lisa Santos, Army medic. Even quiet Tommy Nguyen revealed he'd been a Marine Corps mechanic. This is incredible, said Jessica, the student whose original question had started the conversation. I had no idea there were so many veterans in our class. Why doesn't anyone ever talk about this? Because, Sarah said, feeling emboldened by the support around her. When you mention military service, people either treat you like a hero they can't relate to, or like damaged goods they need to handle carefully. Sometimes it's easier to just be a normal student. But you're not normal students, Professor Martinez pointed out. You bring experiences and perspectives that enrich every discussion we have. Sarah, when you talk about the human cost of military decisions, you're not just analyzing theory, you're speaking from lived experience. That's invaluable. Marcus nodded vigorously. I've been sitting in international relations classes listening to professors discuss counterinsurgency tactics I actually implemented. But I never said anything because I didn't want to be that guy, the veteran who always has to one-up everyone with war stories. There's a difference between one-upping and contributing, Martinez said. Your experiences don't make other students' perspectives less valid, but they do add depth and reality to academic discussions. Jenny looked thoughtful. Maybe we should start a study group or something. It might be easier to participate in class discussions if we knew we had backup, people who understand where we're coming from. I'd like that, Sarah said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. It's been months since I've been able to talk about military stuff without feeling like I was speaking a foreign language. As class ended and students began packing up, several of her non-veteran classmates approached Sarah, but instead of the awkward thank yous she'd expected, they asked genuine questions about her experiences and how they related to the course material. When you were talking about split-second decisions, one student asked, how do you think that experience changes how you approach problem-solving in civilian contexts? It was a thoughtful question that treated her military service as a valuable background rather than a curiosity or tragedy. For the first time since starting college, Sarah felt like her past and present selves might actually be able to coexist. Walking out of the classroom, Marcus fell into step beside her. That took guts, he said. I've been thinking about saying something for weeks. Professor Martinez kind of cornered me into it last week, Sarah admitted. But I'm glad he did. This feels better, more honest. Want to grab coffee and talk about that study group idea? I know a place off campus where we won't run into too many other students. Sarah smiled, the first genuinely relaxed smile she'd had in months. I'd like that. Fair warning, though. I'm still figuring out how to be a veteran and a college student at the same time. Aren't we all? Marcus replied. That's why we need each other. Word spread quickly through the small campus community. By the end of the week, Sarah found herself at the center of something she'd never expected, a growing network of student veterans who had been quietly navigating college life alone. The study group that had started as a casual suggestion had evolved into something more significant. Professor Martinez had offered his office as a meeting space, and on Thursday evening, 12 veterans gathered around the conference table. The diversity surprised Sarah. Different ages, branches, eras of service, and academic majors. What united them was the shared experience of feeling caught between two worlds. I never realized how many of us there were, said David Kim, the former Navy submariner who was now majoring in marine biology. I've been here 2 years and I thought I was the only veteran on campus. The administration keeps statistics, Professor Martinez said, but there's no central way for veterans to connect with each other. Most of you are using your GI Bill benefits through the financial aid office, but that's not exactly a social networking system. Lisa Santos, the former Army medic now studying nursing, leaned forward. I tried joining regular student organizations, but it's hard to relate. Last semester I went to a few meetings of the pre-health club, and they spent an entire hour debating whether studying abroad might hurt their medical school applications. I kept thinking about the field hospitals I'd worked in, but how do you bring that up without sounding pretentious? That's exactly the problem, Sarah agreed. Our frame of reference is so different. When people complain about stress, I want to be supportive, but part of me is thinking about what real stress looks like. Tamin Nguyen, the quiet marine mechanic, spoke up for the first time. My advisor keeps pushing me to take leadership roles in student organizations. She says it'll look good on my resume, but I don't know how to explain that I've already led teams in life or death situations. Student government feels like playing house. Professor Martinez nodded thoughtfully. What if we approached this differently? Instead of trying to fit into existing campus structures, what if we created something new? Something that serves both the veteran community and the broader student body? Like what? Jenny asked. Well, Martinez said, pulling out a notebook he'd been writing in, I've been thinking about this since our class discussion earlier this week. What if we developed a peer mentorship program? Veterans helping other veterans navigate college life, but also veterans contributing their expertise to academic discussions and campus initiatives. Sarah felt a spark of interest. You mean like officially recognizing that our military experience has academic value? Exactly. Sarah, you could guest lecture in my international relations classes about air power doctrine. Marcus, Your experience with counterinsurgency could inform our security studies curriculum. Lisa, you could work with the nursing program to discuss emergency medicine in resource-limited environments. The idea resonated around the table. These weren't charity cases or broken veterans who needed fixing. They were valuable resources being underutilized. But how do we make that happen without becoming the campus war story attractions? David asked. Jenny had been quiet, but now she looked up with excitement. What if we partnered with the academic departments? Not as guest speakers dropping in to tell war stories, but as teaching assistants or research partners? Make it official, make it academic. I love that idea, Lisa said. I've been struggling in my anatomy classes because the professor teaches everything in theory, but I've seen actual trauma cases. I know how the body responds to different types of injuries. That knowledge could help other students understand the material better. Professor Martinez was writing rapidly. We could pilot this next semester, partner with willing faculty members to integrate veteran expertise into existing curricula, but we'd need institutional support. Leave that to me, said a voice from the doorway. Dr. Patricia Walsh, the Dean of Students, stepped into the room. I hope you don't mind the interruption. Professor Martinez mentioned you were meeting and I wanted to introduce myself. Sarah tensed slightly, unsure what administrative attention might mean for their informal group. Dr. Walsh seemed to sense the wariness. I'm not here to impose structure or bureaucracy, she said, taking a seat at the edge of the group. I'm here because this university has been failing its veteran students and I'd like to change that. She continued, we have excellent support services for traditional students, study groups, social organizations, career counseling, but we've never developed resources specifically for veterans beyond processing GI Bill paperwork. Frankly, we didn't realize how many veteran students we had because most of you have been navigating college invisibly. Marcus leaned back in his chair. So what are you proposing? I'm proposing we make this official, Dr. Walsh said. Not just a study group, but a recognized student organization with funding, space, and institutional support. The Veteran Student Success Initiative. You'd work with faculty to integrate military perspectives into appropriate curricula, provide peer mentorship for incoming veteran students, and serve as a bridge between military and civilian campus communities. Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. That sounds amazing, but also like a lot of pressure. What if we're not ready for that kind of visibility? Then you start small and build gradually, Dr. Walsh replied. The point isn't to turn you into poster children for veteran success. The point is to recognize that your military experience is an asset, not something to hide or overcome. Tommy, who had been quiet through most of the meeting, suddenly spoke up. My little brother is a senior in high school. He's been thinking about military service, but he's also worried about college. If we'd had something like this when I started here, it would have made a huge difference. That's exactly the point, Professor Martinez said. You're not just helping yourselves, you're creating a framework for future veteran students. As the meeting wound down, Sarah realized something had fundamentally shifted. For months, she'd been trying to figure out how to fit her military self into civilian college life. Now she was part of a group that was changing how the college approached veteran students entirely. Walking back to her dorm with Jenny and Lisa, Sarah felt lighter than she had in months. This feels big, Jenny said, like potentially life-changing big. Good big or scary big? Lisa asked. Sarah considered the question. Both. But for the first time since I got here, I feel like I might actually belong. As they reached the dorms and prepared to part ways, Sarah realized she had one more thing to say. Thank you, both of you. I've been feeling like I was losing myself trying to be someone I'm not. It's good to know I'm not alone. None of us are alone anymore, Jenny replied. That's the whole point. 3 months later, Sarah stood at the podium in the university's main auditorium, looking out at an audience that would have terrified her just a semester ago. The end-of-year student research symposium typically showcased senior theses and graduate projects, but this year included a special presentation from the newly formed Veteran Student Success Initiative. Her presentation topic had grown organically from the conversations that started in Professor Martinez's classroom. Bridging Worlds, How Military Experience Enhances Civilian Academic Learning. What had begun as her personal struggle to reconcile her two identities had evolved into a research project documenting how veteran students could enrich the entire campus community. When I first arrived at this university 8 months ago, Sarah began, her voice steady despite her racing heart, I made a deliberate choice to hide my military service. I thought it would be easier to blend in, to be just another college student worried about grades and social activities. I was wrong. In the audience, she could see her parents, who had driven down for the presentation. Her mother's eyes were bright with tears of pride, while her father, himself a veteran, nodded with understanding. Professor Martinez sat in the front row with Dr. Walsh and several other faculty members who had become partners in the initiative. What I learned is that trying to separate my military experience from my academic life wasn't protecting anyone. It was diminishing both. My 3 tours as an Apache pilot with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment weren't separate from my education. They were foundational to it. Sarah clicked to her first slide, which showed statistics on veteran enrollment and academic performance. This university has 127 veteran students currently enrolled. Before this semester, 89% of them reported feeling disconnected from campus life, and 67% were considering transferring to other institutions. These numbers represent a significant loss of valuable perspectives and experiences. She moved through her presentation methodically, documenting how the Veteran Student Success Initiative had changed both individual outcomes and campus culture. Marcus Thompson, now serving as the organization's peer mentor coordinator, had helped establish support networks that reduced veteran student attrition by 40%. Jenny Rodriguez was working with the political science department to develop a new course on intelligence analysis that drew from real-world experience. Lisa Santos had partnered with the nursing program to create simulation scenarios based on actual combat medical situations. But the benefits weren't one-directional, Sarah continued. When veteran students began contributing their expertise to classroom discussions, it enhanced learning for everyone. Theoretical concepts became concrete. Abstract policy discussions gained human context. Traditional students reported that they developed deeper understanding of course material when it was informed by lived experience. She paused at a slide showing feedback from non-veteran students. One quote stood out, "Having Sarah in our international relations class completely changed how I understand foreign policy. When she talked about the human cost of military decisions, it wasn't abstract anymore. It made me a better student and a more thoughtful citizen." The most significant finding, Sarah said, building toward her conclusion, is that integration works both ways. Veterans don't need to choose between their military identity and their civilian education. When institutions create space for both, everyone benefits. She clicked to her final slide, which showed the program's expansion plans. Next year, we'll be implementing formal partnerships with 6 academic departments, establishing a mentorship program for incoming veteran students, and creating research opportunities that leverage military expertise. We're also developing relationships with veteran communities at other universities to share resources and best practices. Sarah looked out at the audience, seeing faces that had become familiar over the semester, classmates who now knew her full story, professors who valued her contributions, fellow veterans who had found their voices alongside her. When Professor Martinez first noticed my Apache pin and asked me to stay after class, I thought my carefully constructed civilian identity was about to crumble. Instead, it became the beginning of integrating all parts of who I am. I learned that I don't have to choose between being a veteran and being a student. I can be both, and each identity makes the other stronger. The applause was sustained and genuine. As Sarah stepped away from the podium, she felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with ending her presentation. She had found her place in this new world, not by hiding who she had been, but by bringing all of herself into who she was becoming. Professor Martinez approached her as the audience dispersed. "Outstanding work, Sarah. You've accomplished something remarkable here." "We've accomplished something remarkable," she corrected. "None of this would have happened without you seeing that pin and deciding to ask questions." "Actually," Martinez said with a smile, "I think it would have happened eventually. You were never meant to stay hidden. You just needed the right moment to emerge." Sarah's parents reached them, her mother pulling her into a tight embrace. "We're so proud of you, sweetheart, not just for the presentation, but for finding your way." Her father, a man of few words, simply handed her a small velvet box. Inside was a new pin, not the Apache helicopter she'd worn to hide among military colleagues, but a university emblem with a subtle military ribbon incorporated into the design. "For both parts of who you are," he said quietly. As Sarah pinned it to her jacket, she realized this was what integration actually looked like. Not choosing between identities, but creating space for all of them to coexist. She was Chief Warrant Officer Sarah Chen, and college student Sarah Chen, and researcher Sarah Chen, and each role informed and strengthened the others. Looking around at the diverse group of people who had become her community, veterans and civilians, faculty and students, family and friends, Sarah understood that her real mission hadn't ended when she left the military. It had simply evolved. Now, instead of flying helicopters to extract soldiers from dangerous situations, she was helping extract fellow veterans from the isolation of hiding who they were. Both missions, she realized, were about bringing people home safely. The only difference was the aircraft she was flying. Sarah's journey from hiding in the shadows to standing in the spotlight represents thousands of similar stories across campuses nationwide. Every day, student veterans navigate the complex transition from military service to civilian education, often carrying valuable experiences and perspectives while feeling disconnected from their academic communities. The small Apache helicopter pin that Professor Martinez noticed wasn't just a piece of military memorabilia. It was a symbol of service, sacrifice, and skills that could enrich entire learning communities when given the chance to emerge from hiding. Sarah's transformation from an invisible student to a campus leader illustrates the profound impact that recognition and integration can have, not just for individual veterans but for everyone around them. The Veteran Student Success Initiative that grew from one honest conversation continues to expand, creating bridges between military and civilian worlds that strengthen both. When we create space for veterans to share their experiences and expertise, we don't just help them succeed, we help entire communities learn from their service. These stories matter because behind every uniform, every deployment, every transition back to civilian life, there are human beings who have served something larger than themselves. They've made sacrifices, gained invaluable experience, and developed perspectives that can benefit us all, if we're willing to see past the surface and recognize the heroes who might be sitting right next to us. Today, take a moment to look around your classroom, your workplace, your community. That quiet person who carries themselves with particular purpose, who seems to notice things others miss, who brings unexpected depth to conversations about service and sacrifice. They might be carrying their own Apache pin, waiting for someone to notice and care enough to ask their story. To our veterans, your service didn't end when you left the military. Your experiences have value beyond what you might realize, and your perspectives can change lives and strengthen communities. You don't have to hide who you are to belong where you are. If you found Sarah's story meaningful, please subscribe for more stories of hidden heroes among us. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that their service matters, their experiences have value, and they're not alone in navigating the bridge between military and civilian life. Every story shared is another veteran who doesn't have to walk that bridge alone. Honor our veterans not just with words of thanks, but with the recognition that they bring gifts to our communities that extend far beyond their military service. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones sitting quietly in the third row, waiting for someone to notice their pin and care enough to ask about the story behind it. Subscribe for more stories of courage, service, and the heroes hiding in plain sight. Their stories deserve to be told, and they deserve to know they're not alone.